3 weeks before the wedding, Emily sat across from Calvin at their small kitchen table, thinking they were going to go over last-minute plans. Instead, he folded his hands, looked her straight in the eye, and said quietly, "I don't love you anymore." The words hit her like a sudden blow. At first, she thought she had misheard him. She laughed nervously, waiting for him to explain, to soften it, to tell her it was stress talking. But Calvin didn't flinch. His face was calm, almost practiced. Emily's chest tightened as she whispered, "What are you saying?" He exhaled sharply, as if he'd been holding this in for weeks. "I can't marry you, Em. I should have told you earlier, but it didn't feel right lying anymore." Her heart pounded so loudly she barely heard the rest. He wasn't just breaking off the wedding. He was leaving her for someone else. And not just anyone. He admitted he had reconnected with her cousin Marissa, the cousin who had been her childhood companion, the one who used to braid her hair at family gatherings, the cousin who smiled at her bridal shower as if nothing was brewing behind the scenes. Emily sat frozen. Shame burned her cheeks while her hands shook in her lap. The betrayal wasn't only romantic, it was blood deep, something that would stain every family gathering, every holiday. "You're joking," she finally managed to say, though she already knew he wasn't. The way he avoided her eyes told her enough. Calvin leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. "I never meant for it to happen. But it did. And it feels right with her. I can't keep pretending with you." The room spun. For a moment, Emily thought she might be sick. She remembered the months of planning, the deposits she had scraped together from her savings, the dress hanging in the closet upstairs, and the invitations already mailed. The pitying looks from friends and co-workers flashed through her mind before they even happened. "You waited until now?" Her voice cracked, half broken, half furious. 3 weeks before the wedding, Calvin. "You couldn't tell me sooner?" He shrugged like it made no difference. "I didn't want to ruin things until I was sure." Tears blurred her vision. She pushed her chair back and stood, her legs barely supporting her. "You already ruined everything." That night, Emily sat alone in the bedroom they once shared, staring at the dress she had dreamed of wearing. The silence was suffocating. Every corner of the apartment carried pieces of him. The books he'd stacked on the shelves, the photos on the fridge of their trips, the ring glinting on her finger that now felt like a cruel joke. In one evening, her future had been stolen, not just by Calvin but by Marissa too. She thought of her parents, of how humiliated they would be when the truth came out. She thought of the money gone, savings she couldn't get back. She thought of the whispers at work, the sympathetic smiles, the way everyone would know she had been left. Emily curled into herself on the bed and cried until morning. The betrayal cut deeper than she thought her heart could bear. And yet, beneath the heartbreak, something else began to stir. A faint flicker of resolve whispered that even though she was broken now, this wasn't the end of her story. Emily carried the last of her boxes down the narrow stairwell, her arms trembling from the weight. The apartment that once felt like home now felt like a graveyard of promises. She left behind the couch they had bought together, the dishes they had picked out, even the rug in the living room she had chosen after weeks of searching. She couldn't afford to fight for them, and truthfully, she didn't want them. Every item carried his shadow. She loaded her car and drove away, the ring of her tires on the pavement echoing the finality of it all. Her new place was nothing more than a small studio near the hospital. The walls were thin, the carpet worn, and the rent took more of her paycheck than she liked. But it was hers, and for now that was enough. At night, when she closed her eyes, she could still see the wedding invitations stacked on her desk, reminders of the money she would never see again. Florists, caterers, venues, none of it refundable. She calculated the numbers until her head spun, realizing she had nothing left except debt and shame. Family gatherings became unbearable. When she showed up at her parents' house one Sunday for dinner, Marissa was there. She sat across the table, hand in hand with Calvin, both of them acting as if their relationship wasn't born out of betrayal. No one said a word. Forks clinked against plates while silence pressed down heavier than words ever could. Her parents tried to fill the space with small talk, but Emily felt every glance, every stiff smile. She excused herself early, claiming a long shift, and drove home in tears. The hospital became her refuge. She begged for extra shifts, staying on her feet for hours at a time just so she wouldn't have to go home to the quiet. She worked through exhaustion, her body aching, her eyes red from lack of sleep. She told herself the overtime pay would help chip away at her losses, but the truth was, she just didn't want to think. Patients came and went, and she focused on their needs with a kind of desperate devotion, as if caring for them could mend the gaping wound inside her. One night, as she was finishing paperwork, her supervisor, Mrs. Alvarez, called her into the office. Emily straightened her scrubs, wondering if she had made a mistake. Instead, Mrs. Alvarez gave her a long look and said, "I know you've been taking on too much, but I have something that might help you. It's demanding, but it pays well." Emily raised her brows. "What is it?" "A private care assignment. A man recovering from a serious accident. He needs around-the-clock help. Most of the staff turned it down because he's difficult, but you have patience. You'd be perfect." Emily hesitated. She was already stretched thin, but the mention of higher pay pulled at her. Debt loomed over her, and the idea of saving faster made her heart beat a little steadier. "Who is he?" she asked. Mrs. Alvarez gave a faint smile. "His name is Grant Holloway. You might have heard of him. He's a billionaire investor. Lives on a private estate outside the city. The job won't be easy, but it could change things for you." Emily swallowed hard. The name meant nothing to her, but the weight in her supervisor's voice did. She nodded slowly, unaware of how much this assignment was about to change her life. Emily drove out of the city on a crisp morning, her car winding along long stretches of open road that led toward the mountains. The directions Mrs. Alvarez had given her ended at a set of tall iron gates. They opened slowly after she identified herself to the guard, revealing a long driveway lined with tall pines. At the end of it stood a house so large it felt more like a museum than a home, its stone walls and tall windows catching the early light. She parked near the front entrance, her stomach tight. Carrying her small bag of supplies, she rang the bell. A housekeeper opened the door and led her through wide halls that smelled faintly of leather and polished wood. Paintings hung on the walls, expensive and untouchable. Everything felt quiet, almost too quiet, as though the house itself held its breath. They brought her to a room on the second floor, where Grant Holloway waited. He sat in a large leather chair near the window, a cane resting by his side. His leg was wrapped in a brace, and scars ran along his arm, evidence of the accident. His sharp eyes, however, were what caught her. He studied her the moment she walked in, not with warmth but with suspicion. "So you're the new one," he said, his voice low and rough. Emily nodded, keeping her tone even. "I'm Emily. I'll be helping with your care." He leaned back slightly, arms crossed. "They tell me you're good. I've had 3 others quit already. I don't need someone hovering over me or pitying me. I need someone who does the job." Emily met his gaze. "Then we'll get along fine." For the first week, Grant kept his distance. He followed instructions when it came to medications and therapy, but his words were clipped. If she tried to make small talk, he gave short answers or none at all. He seemed to test her, waiting for her to slip up or reveal some hidden motive. But Emily never asked about his money, his business, or his reputation. She focused on the routine, checking his vitals, helping him walk short distances with support, making sure his pain stayed manageable. When he snapped at her in frustration during a difficult exercise, she didn't flinch. She reminded him calmly that recovery was slow, then continued. In the evenings, she sometimes caught him watching her as she cleaned up or wrote in her notes. His eyes narrowed, not with anger but with something like curiosity. She didn't push. She finished her duties, said goodnight, and left him to the silence of the big house. One night, when she set his cane within reach, he asked suddenly, "Why are you really here?" Emily paused. "I'm here to do my job." He studied her for a long moment before giving a short nod, almost as if the answer unsettled him. He was used to people wanting something from him, access, favors, wealth. But Emily wanted none of it. She was simply steady, present, and professional. As she walked out of the room, Grant leaned back in his chair, unsettled by how unfamiliar that felt. For the first time in weeks, his thoughts lingered on her after the door closed. Days at the Holloway estate began to settle into a rhythm. Emily arrived early, checked Grant's progress, and guided him through the slow work of recovery. At first, he resisted her steady patience, brushing off her encouragement with sharp remarks, but his tone softened as the weeks passed. He noticed how she never sighed in frustration when he faltered, how she steadied his arm without hesitation when his legs gave way. One afternoon, after a difficult round of exercises, Grant collapsed into the chair near the window, sweat beading on his forehead. Emily handed him a glass of water. Instead of drinking it right away, he looked at her. "You don't complain," he said quietly. "Most people would." Emily gave a small shrug. "Complaining doesn't make the work easier." That answer made him smile faintly, the first genuine smile she had seen. For a moment, he looked younger, less worn down by pain. It became easier after that. Grant started speaking to her during their sessions, not about business or money, but about the books he liked, the mountain view from his window, even the music he played in the evenings when the house was too quiet. Emily listened, sometimes laughing at his dry humor, sometimes sharing small pieces of herself. Still, she avoided telling him too much. When he asked about her family or why she had taken the job, she deflected with short replies. He didn't press at first, but one night, after a long silence, he leaned on his cane and studied her as she packed her bag. "You carry something heavy," he said simply. Emily froze, the strap of her bag halfway over her shoulder. For a moment, she thought of brushing it off, but something in his voice, low, steady, not demanding, made her stop. She lowered the bag and sat down across from him. "My fiancé left me," she said softly, the words catching in her throat. "We were supposed to be married. He changed his mind, and it was for someone I trusted." Grant's face hardened, though not at her. He nodded slowly. "People closest to you cut the deepest." She met his eyes, surprised by the sharpness in his tone. "You've been through it too?" His jaw tightened. "In business. In marriage. When there's money, you learn fast how many faces are masks. I lost a wife to a man I thought was my friend. I lost a company deal the same way." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of betrayal hung in the space between them, not as a burden, but as recognition. Emily felt the sting of her own wounds soften slightly. It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was understanding, the kind she hadn't found anywhere else. After that night, something shifted. Grant no longer spoke to her like an employee, but like someone worth listening to. Emily found herself looking forward to their conversations, the way his guarded eyes grew warmer when she entered the room. They didn't need to say it aloud, but a quiet bond had formed, one made not of pity but of scars carried side by side. The house was unusually busy that evening. Grant had told Emily he was meeting with business associates, so she stayed in the background, finishing her notes in the quiet of the hallway. Most nights, she was gone before his guests arrived, but his therapy session had run late, and she lingered to be sure he wasn't in pain. As she walked toward the stairs with her clipboard, laughter drifted from the study. The sound froze her. She knew that laugh. She would have known it anywhere. Slowly, she moved closer, her heart hammering in her chest. Through the open doorway, she saw him, Calvin, standing tall in a tailored suit, smiling in that easy, polished way he used to reserve for her. But now it was turned on Grant. Beside him stood Marissa, her hand hooked through his arm, her lips painted in that bold red Emily had always admired and now despised. Emily's breath caught. She gripped the frame of the door, her stomach twisting. Calvin was speaking with confidence, gesturing toward Grant. "It's an honor, Mr. Halloway. Our firm has admired your work for years. We'd be proud to expand this partnership. I believe we can offer you a fresh perspective." Marissa leaned in, her voice sweet and polished. "Calvin has always been a natural leader. People underestimate his vision, but I've seen it firsthand. He's different from the rest." Emily's nails dug into the wood. Different? The man who abandoned her 3 weeks before their vows, who had left her to face humiliation alone. The cousin who smiled at her bridal shower while stealing her future? They stood in this grand study, presenting themselves as though nothing was wrong, as though they hadn't crushed her life for their own gain. Grant sat behind his desk, listening, his face unreadable. Emily couldn't move. Her body refused to leave, even as her mind screamed at her to run. She watched Calvin flatter and Marissa nod along, both of them weaving their performance with practiced ease. Then Calvin laughed again, that same charming laugh, and it broke her. She stumbled back slightly, knocking against a side table in the hall. A vase rattled, the sound sharp enough to turn heads. Grant's eyes lifted first. They met hers across the distance. His gaze sharpened as he caught the sudden pallor on her face. Emily froze, exposed in that moment. She couldn't disguise the recognition that had shattered her. Calvin turned toward the noise, his smile faltering, but Emily quickly ducked away, retreating down the hall. Her chest heaved, and her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to keep moving. In the silence of a side corridor, she leaned against the wall, her mind racing. The world had folded in on itself. Calvin wasn't just in her past. He was here, in Grant's orbit, climbing higher on the very wreckage of her life. She pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting the sting of tears. She had thought she'd left them behind. But now, fate had thrown them directly into her path again. And Grant had seen everything written on her face. Emily barely made it to her small room at the back of the estate before the tears came. She shut the door, pressed her back against it, and slid down until she was sitting on the floor. Her chest ached as if the wound had been ripped open all over again. Seeing Calvin and Marissa in that room, smiling as if nothing had happened, tore through every fragile layer she had built since the wedding fell apart. She buried her face in her hands, letting the sobs shake her. The humiliation returned in full force, but worse than that was the feeling of being trapped. Calvin was here, in Grant's world, a world Emily had thought was safe from the ghosts of her past. Now he was in the same house where she worked, trying to charm the man who had unknowingly become her anchor. When a knock came at the door, she startled. She wiped her eyes quickly, trying to compose herself, but her voice wavered. Yes, it was Grant. His voice was calm, almost softer than usual. Emily, open the door. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she rose and let him in. He stepped inside slowly, his cane tapping lightly against the wood floor, his eyes never leaving her face. She could see the questions there, but also something steadier, patience. You knew them, he said, not as a question but as a fact. Emily swallowed hard and nodded. Her throat tightened. He was my fiancé, she whispered. We were supposed to be married. He left me for her. My cousin. 3 weeks before the wedding. Grant didn't interrupt. He stood there, steady, letting the words spill out. Emily sank onto the edge of the bed, her voice breaking as she continued. She told him about the apartment, the wasted savings, the shame that followed her, the dinners where her family pretended nothing was wrong. Every detail poured out of her, the things she had kept locked inside, because speaking them aloud had always felt too heavy. By the time she finished, her face was wet and her hands trembled. She braced herself for pity, for the look she hated most, the one that said people felt sorry for her. But Grant didn't give her that. He stayed quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice low and firm. Sometimes revenge isn't loud, he said. It isn't shouting or breaking things. It's taking back the power they stole from you. Quietly. Completely. Emily blinked, surprised by the weight of his words. She shook her head slightly. I don't want to become like them. I don't want my life to be about getting even. He leaned on his cane, his gaze sharp. It's not about becoming like them. It's about not letting them keep what isn't theirs. They took your dignity, your peace. You don't need to scream to get it back. You just need to stand taller than they ever expected you could. The room fell silent again, but this time the quiet wasn't suffocating. Emily's heart still ached, but his words rooted themselves deep inside her. She wasn't ready to act, not yet. But for the first time, she wondered if there was a way to rise, not through bitterness, but through strength they would never see coming. Grant never mentioned Calvin or Marissa again in front of Emily, but she could tell something had shifted. The next time they came to the estate, Grant welcomed them with the same calm tone he used with other associates, his face unreadable. He asked them questions about their ideas, invited them into conversations about business, and acted as though their charm impressed him. To anyone watching, it looked as if Grant was considering them valuable allies. But Emily, who had begun to understand the way his mind worked, knew better. Behind closed doors, Grant's attention turned to her. In the evenings, after his therapy sessions, he would sit with her in the library, papers spread out across the desk. You want to understand how people like Calvin think, he said one night. Learn the game they're desperate to play, and then learn how to play it better. He started with the basics, stocks, investments, contracts. At first, Emily felt lost, staring at numbers that blurred together. But Grant had patience with her in a way she hadn't expected. He broke things down, guiding her through each detail until her confidence grew. She realized how much of the world Calvin had only pretended to understand, and how much he would give to stand where she now sat. You're sharper than you think, Grant told her one evening as she worked through a set of figures on her own. He underestimated you. They both did. That's their weakness, not yours. His words lit something inside her. For so long she had seen herself through the lens of what she had lost, through the humiliation of being abandoned. Now she began to see herself differently, not as broken, but as capable. Weeks passed, and Emily grew more confident. She asked questions, challenged Grant's explanations, and even caught small mistakes in the scenarios he gave her. She felt her mind stretch in ways it never had before. Slowly, the shame that had weighed her down began to loosen its grip. Meanwhile, Calvin and Marissa continued to circle closer to Grant, clearly convinced that they were earning his trust. Emily saw them during meetings, Calvin speaking with that same polished charm, Marissa smiling at all the right moments. But now, instead of shrinking at the sight of them, Emily sat straighter, her head high. She no longer felt like the woman they had left behind. One night, as they reviewed a deal Grant was considering, Emily caught herself leaning forward, pointing out a flaw in the contract. Grant gave her a look of quiet pride. "You see it," he said. "Most people wouldn't. That's what makes you dangerous in the right way." Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest, not because she wanted revenge in the cruel sense, but because she finally felt like she had something of her own. Grant had given her knowledge, yes, but more than that, he had given her back a sense of herself. She wasn't just the woman Calvin had left. She was becoming someone stronger, someone they could never reduce to pity again. The dinner was held in a ballroom filled with chandeliers and soft music, the kind of place Emily had never imagined stepping into. Grant had insisted she join him, telling her it would be good experience. She arrived at his side, dressed simply but elegantly, her nerves quieted by the calm way he carried himself. At one of the long tables, Calvin and Marissa were already seated among business partners and investors. Calvin wore a smile that stretched too wide, his arm draped around Marissa, as if to make a statement. When he spotted Emily, the smile faltered just for a second before he forced it back into place. During the meal, Calvin raised his glass and said with smug pride, "I'd like to introduce Marissa, not just my partner in life, but my future wife. She's been my greatest supporter, and together we're building something strong." His eyes flickered toward Emily as he said it, as though daring her to flinch. Emily didn't. She kept her expression steady, her posture calm. She had no interest in reacting for his satisfaction. Instead, she sipped her wine and let the moment pass without giving him the power he wanted. When it was Grant's turn to speak, he surprised everyone. "I'd also like to recognize someone," he said, his voice carrying easily over the table. "Emily has been working closely with me over the last few months. Her insight, her discipline, and her ability to see things others miss have been invaluable. It's rare to find someone with both intelligence and integrity. She's proven herself to be exactly that." The table shifted as attention turned toward Emily. She felt the weight of their eyes, but instead of shrinking back, she lifted her chin and offered a quiet, confident smile. She thanked Grant with a nod, her voice steady as she added a brief remark about the importance of patience in long-term success. Calvin's smile stiffened. He reached for his glass, trying to mask the irritation in his eyes. For years, he had prided himself on being the one to impress, the one to draw admiration. Now, in a room full of people he wanted to impress, it was Emily who held their interest. Marissa leaned closer to Calvin, but Emily noticed the shift in her cousin's expression. The gleam of confidence in Marissa's eyes had dimmed, replaced by something more calculating. She was starting to see what Emily already knew. Calvin's charm only carried him so far. He wasn't the golden ticket she had imagined. As the night went on, Emily moved through conversations with ease, no longer the woman burdened by shame, but someone sure of herself. Grant remained at her side, quietly guiding when needed but letting her stand in her own strength. Calvin fumbled through questions, his attempts at authority sounding hollow compared to the composed clarity Emily displayed. By the time dessert was served, it was clear to everyone at the table who belonged in the circle of influence. And it wasn't Calvin. Emily didn't need to gloat or even glance his way. Her calm presence was enough to show him, and Marissa, just how far she had risen above the life they once tried to steal from her. The unraveling began quietly. Grant never announced his plans, but Emily noticed the small steps, questions he asked in meetings, documents he reviewed with unusual care, the way his sharp gaze lingered when Calvin spoke too confidently. Calvin had been cutting corners, taking credit for work that wasn't his, and presenting inflated numbers to impress. At first, Emily thought Grant might simply let it slide. But Grant was a man who had built his fortune on precision, and he didn't let dishonesty live long in his world. At a quarterly review, surrounded by senior partners and investors, Grant finally moved. He laid the files on the table, each one carefully prepared, each one exposing the cracks in Calvin's work. "This," Grant said evenly, "is the difference between leadership and pretense. Numbers tell the truth if you know how to read them. And these numbers don't lie." The room went silent as Calvin's face drained of color. He stammered, tried to explain, but every page Grant turned left him smaller, weaker. The partners, once eager to hear Calvin's ideas, now shifted uncomfortably, eyes hardening with disappointment. By the time Grant closed the folder, Calvin's career had already collapsed in front of them. Marissa sat beside him, her smile frozen, her hand clenched around her glass. She had tied herself to his ambition, counting on his rise to carry her along. Now she sat in the wreckage, realizing too late that the man she had betrayed her cousin for was nothing more than a hollow show. Grant leaned back in his chair, his tone calm but final. I will not attach my name to shortcuts or dishonesty. From this point forward, neither of you will have a place in my business. It was not loud. It was not cruel. But it was absolute. Emily didn't speak a word through it all. She simply watched from her seat, her face composed. She hadn't lifted a finger, hadn't needed to. The people who had taken everything from her were now stripped of the very things they valued most. Days later, as she walked to her car outside the hospital, she heard her name. Calvin was there, shoulders slumped, his polished suit wrinkled, his charm gone. He stepped toward her with a desperate look. Emily, please, just hear me out. She stood still, calm, no longer shaken by his presence. He searched her face for some crack, some opening to slide into. I made mistakes, he rushed on. I thought I wanted more, but I see now what I gave up. You were good for me, better than I deserved. Can we? Emily cut him off gently but firmly. Her voice was quiet, steady, carrying no bitterness, only truth. You already had me once, Calvin. You'll never get me again. He opened his mouth to speak, but she was already walking away, her steps light, her head high. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, she felt no weight behind her. The chapter was closed, not with anger, but with the kind of dignity he could never take from her again. The weeks after Calvin's fall passed quietly. Emily noticed the difference in herself most in the mornings. She no longer woke with that heavy knot in her chest. The memories still existed, but they no longer controlled her. When her mind drifted to the wedding dress she had once dreamed of, or to the family dinners clouded with silence, the pain didn't crush her the way it once had. She was learning to let it go, piece by piece. Her strength no longer felt tied to Calvin or Marissa's failures. It came from the late nights in the library, the numbers she had learned to understand, the calm she had discovered in herself when faced with people who once held so much power over her. She had rebuilt her dignity not by tearing others down, but by standing tall on her own. That was the revenge she hadn't known she needed, the quiet triumph of becoming more than what they tried to reduce her to. Grant's recovery was nearly complete by then. He walked with only the faintest limp, his cane resting more often against a wall than in his hand. The sharpness in his eyes remained, but it had softened too, as though something in him had healed beyond the physical. One evening, as Emily finished packing away her notes, he spoke her name in a tone that made her pause. You've been more than a nurse to me, Emily, he said, his voice steady but warm. You've reminded me what trust feels like. I'd like you to stay in my life, if you'd want that. The words hung in the air, carrying more weight than he tried to give them. Emily felt her heart stir, not with the old, reckless rush she once mistook for love, but with something steadier, more real. She smiled softly. Grant, I'm grateful for everything. But right now, I need to figure out what my life looks like for me. He nodded, not disappointed but understanding. That's exactly why you'll be fine. In the days that followed, Emily made her decision. She completed her last shifts at the estate, organizing the files neatly for the nurse who would take over. The staff hugged her goodbye, their warmth a reminder that she had been part of something larger than her pain. Grant walked her to her car on her final day, his eyes steady on hers. Whatever you choose, he said quietly, make sure it's yours. Not theirs. Not mine. Yours. Emily drove away from the estate with the windows down, the cool air rushing in. The city skyline stretched wide in front of her, the sun dipping low but bright on the horizon. For the first time in what felt like forever, the road ahead wasn't weighed down with what-ifs or broken promises. She didn't know exactly where she was going yet, but she knew she was free to choose. And that freedom, earned through heartbreak, resilience, and quiet strength, was more than enough to begin again.